Due to his arrogance and disdain towards death, the king of Ephyra, Sisyphus, found himself condemned to roll a boulder for eternity up a hill. Towards the precipice, the large rock would roll away from the dispirited king, and the process would listlessly repeat ad infinitum, ad nauseam. He was granted immortality of a sort, but was he actually happy? The absurd and constant struggles we humans experience, many of our own making, can be allegorically compared to the myth. This Greek tale of Sisyphus can be paralleled alarmingly with the futile persistence of human life. For all these troubles, we are bound to a conclusion. For dust we are, and to dust we will return. Nonetheless, the French existentialist Camus posited an alternate philosophical perspective on the myth. Indeed, the storms of life can come unexpectedly and harsh, the destination sometimes obscured by waves of woe and doubt, but one must imagine Sisyphus happy, to carry on with moderate contentment in their voyage. If this fallen sovereign is symbolic of each of us, then smile we must. In the mid-20th century, Erving Goffman pioneered the modern-day dramaturgical concept of us all as actors. He perceived inhabitants of developed societies to be playing parts, characters in a pantomime, with the mask perhaps removed only when alone. These masks are multitudinous, too many to manage naming, and are changing all the time. In our Sisyphean journey, we wear disguises which make us frown, and disguises which make us smile. Though ever evolving in its nature, the process of conformity can establish a general social consensus, making it easier for one to identify the role played by another. For instance, due to any subcultural trademarks, hair dye, tattoos, fashion or aesthetic, the actor can more readily apprehend the stranger before them. Language, accent, statement, these are all extensions of the inward personality. As if a stamp across the forehead, identifiers such as badges, uniforms, titles, and even consumerist habits enable the actor to know who to ask, who to avoid, and who to approach. Therefore, we must assume actions and signifiers manifested within the physical realm to be the key to any locked potentiality for companionship. Through conforming, the actor can find solidarity in performers suited to roles much like their own. Kelman in 1958 outlined 3 different types of conformity: compliance, internalization, and identification. The first, compliance, manifests when an individual publicly agrees with a majority group under pressure. The second, internalization, occurs when the individual agrees with the opinions of the majority group, even in private when the pressure has been lifted. And identification denotes the individual conforming due to the expectations of society and the role provided. In 1898, Norman Triplett conducted the first social psychology experiment. He set out to discover whether the perceived presence of another can affect, hinder, or improve the performance and behaviour of an individual. When watching cyclists race, first against the clock and then one another, he noted their increased speed and performance when under competitive strain and observation. Triplett then elected to replicate this in a controlled laboratory environment by asking children to reel in a fishing line. Initially, the child was given the task independently and alone, but when partnered with another child, yet instructed to remain independent, the child reeled noticeably faster. These experiments epitomise the effects of the coaction and audience phenomenon, proving adjusted task performance is ascertained through observation and peer involvement. It calls to mind the militaristic homosexuality practiced in ancient Greece, wherein lovers fought together driven by the attention of their partner. As Plato once famously transcribed in the Symposium, no man is such a craven that the influence of love cannot inspire him with a courage that makes him equal to the bravest born. On the other hand, Qonel in 1968 considers the mere presence of another person to be secondary, and that is in fact a perturbation regarding evaluation, which primarily drives an enhanced performance. Each theory supports the empirically founded yerkes-dodson law, which posits that the over-arousal of one's psychophysiology can blunt performance, or, in other words, cause stage fright. However, conformity features double-edged sharpness. Bands are susceptible to outgroup Trojan horses, viruses which can destroy or manipulate the solidarity of a group from within, and therefore bound to the potential threat of polarization or radicalization. Nonetheless, the healthy conformist must strive to follow in the footsteps of other healthy conformists, lest the cycle break. It is often at the source of devious pandemics, but without a degree of conformity, we would have utmost social alienation, anarchy, and isolation. Though of course one need only review the results founded by Asch, Hoffling, Milgram, and Zimbardo to understand any uncertainties with conforming. In the 1950s, the social and gestalt psychologist Solomon Asch directed an array of studies focusing on peer pressure and conformity. He aimed to understand the social influences capable of manipulating another's opinion in a group, and whether unanimity within that group was paramount to an individual conforming, so as to avoid social ostracization. In the original experiment, 8 subjects were instructed to sit around a table and judge the length of numerous lines. 7 of the participants were Confederates equipped with a series of pre-rehearsed responses, many of which were incorrect. The unknowing, confused 8th candidate from a selection of 50 volunteers was then judged last based on his response. Under such pressure would he defy his peers to speak his mind and the truth, or simply nod along to blatant inaccuracies. On average, over the course of 12 critical evaluations, 75% of subjects conformed, with 36.8% of the total answers incorrect. In further trials, Asch adjusted independent variables to deduce situational factors capable of altering the conformity rate of the subject. When instructed to write the answer rather than declare it, conformity dropped drastically. Similarly, having a dissenting Confederate ally by which to identify with decreased that rate significantly, as much as 80%. Hogg and Volholm in 1995 credit Asch with at least one valuable and rigorous discovery. The size of the majority group is of the utmost importance. When the majority group was at a total of 3, conformity seemed the most likely. Any less and the rate would decrease. A group of more than 3 would incur no greater chance for conformity, but could risk making the minority paranoid of collusion. Asch found unanimity absence within a group can lower overall conformity dependent on the individual's desire to conform normatively for social approval. When the lines were made visually similar to one another, with the difference more difficult to distinguish, the conforming rate increased. As uncertainty went up, as did the tendency to look to the Confederates for confirmation. After debriefing, Asch interviewed the subjects who took part in the procedure. When questioned about their reason for conforming, the participants responded marginally one of 2 ways: to fit in, or out of self-doubt and a desire to be correct. Both answers are representative of the 2 kinds of social conformity in the dual processing dependency model developed by Gerard and Dutch in 1955, that is, normative and informational. Skeptics consider the androcentric sample of young American males to lack population validity, and it also lacks ecological validity, owing to the artificiality and unimportance of the designated task. Very few humans care about such trivial matters. The gender issue correlates negatively with the popular patriarchal and accepted mask of the time. The then paramount camaraderie among the country's male population firmly enforced the act for conformity in service of comfortability. Therein the debate persists over whether Asch's experiment is reflective of an individual's likelihood of conforming, or of the conservative anti-left mainstream culture dominative of 1950s America. Under McCarthyism and patriotic communistic hate, a correct way to think consensus had been established. To this end, Perrin and Spencer in 1980 later replicate the procedure with British students with vastly different results. Over the course of 396 trials, only 1 subject conformed. However, the subjects were British math and science students. The more tolerant 80s Britain, coupled with these subjects' assumably learned tendencies to deduce and solve, likely created a more comforting platform to dissent and vocalise. And so they tried again, this time with immature imprisoned malefactors and confederating prohibition officers. They now displayed results akin to the Asch experiment. The conclusion made by Perrin and Spencer was that the socio-political complications of conforming for the individual naturally affects the outcomes. The situation is, ultimately, key, after all. In 2010 Japan, Mori and Arai accumulated 104 willing men and women to also judge the length of lines, but on this occasion there would be 4 subjects tested in 26 sets. Many knew one another, under their modernised belief that it improved ecological validity. They were all asked to wear peculiar glasses. Each pair had a polarising filter somewhat similar to the anaglyph effect of 3D glasses, which could manipulate overlapping rivalrous or contrasting images. Simply put, they allow one to see something that is not literally there. Even though those 4 individuals were watching the same thing, what they saw was entirely different. There would be 3 identical glasses and 1 unique pair. The minority member would always publicly answer third. The findings for conformity in women closely matched the original research. However, for a number of generational reasons, males were rarely swayed at all. He made me do it. I was just following orders. It wasn't my fault. These words have been uttered by children, by adults, by warriors, by prisoners. It's considered a phrase of the final resort, often interpreted as nonsense even, but is there sometimes truth behind the saying? Agentic murder is food for the philosopher's appetite. Could we truly kill one another with little thought? Charles K. Hoefling's 1966 naturalistic experiment with 22 night nurses, wherein a Confederate would phone impersonating a Dr. Smith and ask the professional to over-administer a fake placebo-planted drug to another Confederate patient called Mr. Jones, proved how easily a human can be unknowingly convinced to seriously harm another. 21 of the surveyed nurses broke a number of hospital rules when they complied with the fake doctor. When another 22 nurses were asked if they would have complied, 21 also said they would not. In 1963, Stanley Milgram, a student of Asch's, recruited and paid 40 male subjects to take part in a notorious experiment on the effects of learning. 2 roles were constructed, student and teacher, and then physically divided from one another. The student, apparently in the neighbouring room, strapped to a chair with electrodes, was a constant planted stooge. The 40 teachers were deceived into believing otherwise, and individually instructed by a lab coat-wearing examiner to ask a series of premeditated questions directed towards the student. If the student answered correctly, the quiz would proceed. Incorrectly, and the teacher would need to reactively apply a shock of up to 450 volts, a considerable amount more than required to kill a human. The student, in fact a pre-recording, would scream and beg in response to the gradual pain, eventually falling silent altogether. If the teacher protested, the examiner would strongly suggest that they continue. Many apprehended and trialed Nazis following the reign of Hitler blamed their actions on orders, refusing to admit that they wanted to do it. Milgram was interested in this deference. How could so many people commit so many atrocities under a misguided belief that what they were doing was right? How is it possible for one's ethical paradigm and perception of reality to distort to such a degree that their actions and logic defy their true self? Or, to a greater and similar extent, how is it possible for one's true self to emerge under the protective command of a superior? Prior to the experiment, Milgram and his peers predicted an obedience rate of under 10%. All subjects reached 300 volts. They entered an agentic state of mind, assuming the overlooking authority to take responsibility for any of their actions, and in doing so, quote-unquote, innocently killed a man in the name of science. Ultimately, 65% of the participants continued shocking the innocent student past the threshold, past the silent response, all the way up to 450 volts. The ethical considerations following the publication of his results were almost as widespread as its supposed socio-scientific revelations. While arguably necessary, a baby of post-enlightened thinking in the way that the infamous Little Alba experiment had been before, it nonetheless left a bitter taste in many mouths. In their very nature, these experiments were to be dark, as they dissected the more macabre facets of humanity and psychology, and due to this, many of the questions posed in response by following empaths asked, well, where does the line persist? By what means do we ecologically gather this information, this valuable intel on the psychological shadows of the human brain without, well, overstepping the line? In 1973, Philip Zimbardo investigated the supposed brutality of many American prison guards. He was curious whether the situational environment and permitted hierarchy of prison life was capable of eliciting a sadistic personality, or if the individual's disposition prior to the role made such barbarism inevitable. Zimbardo selected 24 male college students from a voluntary pool of 75 and paid them $15 daily to take part in a prison simulation experiment to find out, though ultimately only 11 guards and 10 prisoners were involved, as one dropped out and 2 were left on standby. The participants were given roles randomly, prisoner and guard, and taken to the basement of Stanford University, remodelled and repurposed for the sake of the procedure to closely resemble a genuine prison, complete with a confinement cell for disobedient captives. The prisoners had even been arrested, booked and analysed by police prior to the event so as to retain a sense of fear and realism. After naked delousing, the prisoners were issued uniforms, a nylon cap, an ankle chain, and a smock with the individual's ID number, and for the sake of de-individuation, these numbers would become their new names. The guards, on the other hand, adorned khaki outfits and sunglasses and were assigned billy clubs and whistles. They were instructed to maintain order within the prison by any means assigned violence. Within no time, harassment ensued. The guards exercised their newly gifted control through demeaning acts of belittlement, via insults, physical punishment, trivial ordering, and other such methods of dehumanization. The prisoners reacted with, at first, subordination. However, by the second day, matters had escalated. They colluded together, barricading themselves within their cells, free of nylon caps and numbered smocks. Once the uprising had been disbanded, They then stripped each prisoner nude and solitarily confined the ringleaders. To further destroy any solidarity formed, they designated one of the now empty cells for well-behaved prisoners, who merely went along with the previous revolt. Such privileged inmates were returned basic human rights as a reward, and thusly envied by their cohorts. As dependence and reliance on the guards grew, the prisoners were trapped with an increased amount of contempt and dismissiveness. At one point, prisoner 819 withdrew into a state of hysterical sobbing and was permitted a resting period in an alternative room. While 819 recuperated, the guards lined his fellow inmates up and instructed them to loudly chant slander against him. When Zimbardo attempted to convince him to depart the experiment, he refused, afraid to be labelled a bad prisoner further by his peers. Zimbardo firmly reminded him of his real identity, and almost immediately, 819 was ready to leave. The prisoners and the guards adapted to their roles so much so that they lost themselves in it. The mask remained warm for so long that it began fusing with the flesh, and eventually by day 6, following a number of similar incidents, Zimbardo was forced to the realization that he himself was also over-immersed and de-individuated, almost becoming one with the strict overseer he had committed to play, and the experiment was concluded. There's much to see in Zimbardo's spectacle. However, the prison experiment has come under a great amount of scrutiny since its debut. Many guards have admitted to acting, and the design setting lacks ecological validity. Similarly, the sample selected consisted of male Americans. The derogatory treatment of voluntary participants resulted in the fortification of ethical guidelines utilised by the American Psychological Association regarding studies, now requiring an extensive evaluation and review beforehand and after the procedure, and the later commercialisation of the Stanford Prison experiment.
This is all real. They won't let you go. They won't let us leave.
In the name of money and fame, could be considered, perhaps, taboo, and manipulative of any scientific authenticity behind Zimbardo's work. In a later interview, Zimbardo in 2017, when asked what he would have done differently, replied commenting on the lack of an overwatcher, ombudsman, and his desire to positively train some guards beforehand to monitor the likely difference response. Even the wording of the ad, originally published in a newspaper, has been proven to be somewhat misleading. Carnahan and McFarland in 2007 discovered a large psychological discrepancy between subjects who applied for a prison-specific psychology experiment and subjects applying for a more common experiment, omitting the phrase prison altogether. Those who applied to the prison-based advert were reported as scoring higher narcissism, authoritarianism, and aggressiveness. But, despite the wide criticism, the experiment proved influential and revolutionary for the field of psychology. The BBC in 2001 even replicated the experiment, only to find opposite results. The prisoners took control. Cognitive dissonance and role de-individuation or confusion can be entirely based on the implications and situation. One can easily adapt to the blurry mask, that temporarily induced prosopagnosia of the inner face, capable of regressing, manipulating, changing, pushing who we are. It's certainly daunting. With such overwhelming evidence against the fragility of our masks, both the unique and similar, the question of ourselves comes into question. Who we are tomorrow may not be who we are today. Perhaps who you are, who each of us are, is a performance. For example, Alfred Kinsey in 1948 and 1953 revealed the hidden sexual promiscuity of the masses, and that revelation follows through in the darkest corners of Pornhub and 4chan. The Savills and Weinsteins of the world live among us in secret. Almost every day the mask can slip, it can be replaced. We are aware of how far a human will go to smile or see a smile. The human psychology is fascinating, awesome, and wicked.